This is the story of how scientists spent most of the 20th century getting Neanderthals completely wrong, and how a Nobel Prize-winning geneticist used ancient DNA to overturn nearly everything the field believed about them. Neanderthals were not the brutish dead end of human evolution. They were intelligent, culturally sophisticated, and they interbred with modern humans, which means their genes are sitting inside billions of living people right now. Before we get into it, if this kind of deep dive science history is what you come here for, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. A skeleton uncovered at La Chapelle-aux-Saints, France in 1908 became the foundation for one of the longest-running mistakes in modern science. 3 years after its discovery, a French paleontologist named Marcelin Boule examined it and produced a reconstruction that portrayed Neanderthals as stooped ape-like creatures, barely upright, closer to primate than to person. That image moved through textbooks, museums, and popular media, defining public understanding of Neanderthals for the better part of a century, which made the error all the more consequential. What Boule had failed to account for, or chose not to address, was that the skeleton came from an individual with severe arthritis and osteoarthritis, conditions that warped the posture and the joints in ways that had nothing to do with the species as a whole. A single diseased body had been treated as a representative specimen, and a portrait built on that mistake held its authority for decades. The official theory that traveled alongside this image was equally wrong. Under what scientists called the out of Africa with complete replacement model, Neanderthals were classified as a separate species that went fully extinct when modern humans arrived in Europe, with no interbreeding, no shared offspring, and no genetic continuation of any kind. Modern humans simply replaced them, and the story moved on without examining whether any of that was actually true. That model held until the technology to extract and read ancient DNA arrived, and when it did, the replacement model did not bend under the evidence, it broke entirely. If this is the kind of history you come here for, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe before we keep going. Svante Pääbo, a Swedish geneticist working at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, changed what was considered possible in 1997, when he and his colleague Matthias Krings successfully sequenced mitochondrial DNA from the original 1856 Neanderthal specimen found in the Neander Valley near Düsseldorf, Germany. Getting usable genetic material from bones of that age had been viewed by most of the scientific community as effectively impossible, which made the result all the more significant. Pääbo spent the next decade refining the methods needed to go further, and on May 7, 2010, those methods produced a finding that forced a rewriting of human prehistory. Published in the journal Science and led by researcher Richard E. Green with Pääbo as senior author, the draft Neanderthal genome came primarily from 3 female Neanderthal bones recovered at Vindija Cave in Croatia, bones dating to between 38,000 and 44,000 years ago. What the genome showed left no room for ambiguity. Neanderthals had contributed approximately 1 to 4% of the DNA now carried by non-African modern humans. Later research refined that number to approximately 1.5 to 2.1% on average for people of European descent, and slightly higher, around 2.3 to 2.6% for people of East Asian ancestry. A 2020 study published in the journal Cell added another dimension when it found that populations in Africa, long assumed to carry no Neanderthal DNA at all, carry approximately 0.3%, the likely result of back migration from Eurasia into Africa thousands of years after the initial interbreeding occurred. That interbreeding happened primarily between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago as modern humans spread out of Africa into Eurasia, and research points to at least 3 to 4 separate encounters at different times and locations rather than a single event. The most direct evidence of what those encounters produced came from a specimen found at Peștera cu Oase, a cave in Romania dating to approximately 40,000 years ago, whose bones carried between 6 and 9% Neanderthal DNA, indicating a Neanderthal ancestor only 4 to 6 generations back in that individual's family line. That was a person living in Ice Age Europe with a great-great-grandparent or possibly a great-great-great-grandparent who had been a Neanderthal, and the strict boundary that the old model had drawn between the two species was always far more porous than anyone had officially admitted. In October 2022, Paabo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, with the committee citing his discoveries concerning the genomes of extinct hominins and human evolution, and that prize functioned as the formal scientific acknowledgement that the question of what Neanderthals actually were had been answered, and the answer changed everything that came before it. Neanderthal DNA did not enter the modern human gene pool and sit there as an inert artifact. It carried functional genetic information that continued shaping human biology across 50,000 years, and scientists are still mapping exactly what it does. Variants in 3 immune system genes designated TLR1, TLR6, and TLR10 came from Neanderthals and helped modern humans fight infections in Eurasian environments their African ancestors had never encountered. Neanderthal-derived genes also shaped keratin, the protein governing the properties of skin and hair, giving early modern humans a biological advantage as they adapted to the colder climate of Northern Europe. These were practical tools acquired from a population that had already spent hundreds of thousands of years surviving in exactly those conditions. And none of that inheritance arrived by accident. But the same genetic transfer carried costs that show up clearly in modern health data. And that's where the picture gets more complicated. In 2020, Hugo Zeberg and Svante Paabo identified a Neanderthal-derived gene cluster on chromosome 3 as a major genetic risk factor for severe COVID-19, one that roughly doubled the risk of serious illness in people who carry it. And that variant sits in approximately 50% of people in South Asia and about 16% of people in Europe. A follow-up study published in 2021 found a separate Neanderthal variant on chromosome 12 that runs in the opposite direction, reducing the risk of severe COVID-19 by approximately 22%. Elevated type 2 diabetes risk in Latin American populations traces partly to a Neanderthal-derived variant in a gene called SLC16A11, and some Neanderthal variants connect to increased risk for depression and blood clotting disorders. None of this sorts neatly into benefit or harm because it was never designed to. What Neanderthals passed down was a set of adaptations that helped in one environment and created costs in another, and 50,000 years later, those adaptations are still shaping the health of billions of people alive today. The genetic findings opened the door to a much larger reconsideration of Neanderthal capability, and what researchers found there was not what the textbook image had prepared anyone to expect. Cave paintings in 3 Spanish sites, La Pasiega, Maltravieso and Ardales, were dated in a 2018 study published in Science to at least 65,000 years ago using uranium-thorium dating, placing them more than 20,000 years before modern humans arrived in Europe. If those dates hold under continued scrutiny, Neanderthals painted them. A study published that same year in Science Advances reported perforated and pigment-stained shells at Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, dating to approximately 115,000 years ago, pointing again to ornamentation and symbolic behavior long before modern humans set foot on the European continent. Cut-marked eagle talons from Krapina, Croatia, at approximately 130,000 years old, have been interpreted as jewelry or ceremonial ornaments, and intentional burial of the dead was confirmed at multiple sites, with findings from a re-excavation of La Chapelle-aux-Saints published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2014. Their tools followed the same pattern of sophistication. Neanderthals employed the Levallois technique, a demanding stone flaking method requiring planning and precision for at least 200,000 years, and they produced adhesive from birch bark through a controlled heating process, with evidence from sites in both Italy and Germany. A 2020 study in Scientific Reports identified a fragment of 3-ply cord from a French site dating to between 41,000 and 52,000 years ago, indicating knowledge of fiber manipulation that requires deliberate skill. Analysis of dental calculus from El Cedrón cave in Spain showed Neanderthals eating cooked vegetables and mushrooms and using plants including yarrow and chamomile in ways consistent with medicinal intent, and a separate nature analysis from 2017 found evidence of self-medication with poplar bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, and with penicillium mold, a natural antibiotic. Neanderthal brain volume ran larger than that of modern humans on average at approximately 1,400 to 1,600 cubic centimeters against a modern human average of around 1,350 cubic centimeters. The hyoid bone recovered at Kebara Cave in Israel, directly involved in speech production, is virtually identical to the equivalent bone in modern humans, and Neanderthals carried the FOXP2 gene variant associated with language in our own species. Researchers like Joan Zillo of the University of Barcelona have argued, based on this full body of evidence, that the cognitive distinction between Neanderthals and modern humans is increasingly difficult to defend. No single explanation accounts for why Neanderthal populations vanished as a distinct group around 40,000 years ago, and most researchers working on this question agree that the real answer involves several pressures running simultaneously. Competition with modern humans for food and resources is one factor, given that Homo sapiens populations were significantly larger at the time. Rapid climate fluctuations during the late Pleistocene created environmental shifts that placed additional pressure on populations already under stress. And disease carried by incoming modern humans likely contributed as well. Genetic data published in Nature in 2014, led by researcher Kay Prufer, reveals that Neanderthal genetic diversity sat very low, suggesting the total population spread across all of Eurasia hovered somewhere between roughly 5,000 and 70,000 individuals at any given point in time. A species at those numbers, distributed across an entire continent, carries very little margin for sustained disruption of any kind, and that is where absorption enters the picture. Repeated episodes of interbreeding with the much larger modern human population gradually folded the Neanderthal genetic contribution into a gene pool that dwarfed it. And as Neanderthal numbers fell and modern human numbers climbed, what had been a distinct population dissolved into the broader human lineage. Extinction and absorption ran alongside each other for thousands of years, and the species that exists today carries the biological result of both processes running at once. An estimated 20% of the total Neanderthal genome can now be reconstructed from fragments distributed across modern human genomes worldwide. Every person of non-African descent carries Neanderthal DNA, and even populations in Africa carry a measurable portion of it. Those genes are not decorative, they affect immune function, skin biology, and disease risk, and they shaped how people respond to infections, including a coronavirus that emerged in the 21st century. Pabo put it directly after receiving the Nobel Prize, Neanderthals live on in some of us. Coming from the scientist who spent decades building the methods to prove it, that statement carries the full weight of the evidence behind it. The species portrayed for most of the 20th century as a stooped, dim-witted evolutionary failure buried its dead, created art, made medicine from plants, manufactured adhesives, crafted jewelry from eagle talons, survived multiple ice ages across hundreds of thousands of years, and left a measurable biological mark on billions of people alive right now. Science built a portrait from a misread skeleton, and that portrait held far longer than it deserved. The genome told a different story, and that story is still being written with each new study that identifies another Neanderthal variant and traces what it continues to do inside living people. If this video gave you something to think about, leave a like, share it with someone who would find it worth watching, and subscribe so you are here for the next one.